Christmas morning, Dad rose and shouted, "Get out! Paying bills doesn't make you family." Mom sneered, "Stop being jealous of your sister." I smiled, "Then handle your own bills." The next day, Dad called the cops on me. When the officer reviewed the files, he looked at Dad and said 4 words that made them tremble. "Can you imagine pouring your heart and soul, and nearly $500,000, into supporting your family for 8 years, only to be told on Christmas morning to get out, and then have your own father call the police on you?" Because that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't just my holiday that shattered, it was my entire world. My name is Hannah. I'm 32 now, and on paper, I'm pretty impressive. I'm the head of product innovation at a fintech company, Horizon Pay. That means my life is a constant blur of 14 to 16-hour days, endless screens, and back-to-back meetings, including most weekends, chasing deadlines and impossible launches. The money is very good, close to $500,000 a year when you add in bonuses and stock. But the cost? I live on takeout and caffeine, and my shoulders feel like they're made of stone. For years, I told myself all that grind was worth it because I was doing something noble, I was taking care of my family. And there I was, Christmas morning, pulling my car into the familiar driveway in Cedar Falls. My parents' little brick house, usually a comfort, sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. A dusting of snow softened the sagging gutters and cracked front steps. The sky was that pale winter gray that makes everything look flat and still. I let the engine idle for a moment, watching my breath fog the windshield, a knot tightening in my chest. I'd driven in from Columbus before the sun came up, 3 hours of empty highway and bad coffee. The back seat was loaded with gift bags, a basket of pastries from a fancy bakery, and ingredients for a full Christmas breakfast. I'd planned every detail, meticulously. I could feel both parts of my life pressing on me at once, the polished, high-pressure world of Horizon Pay, where people shook my hand and called me brilliant, and this small Midwestern house where I turned back into the oldest daughter from Cedar Falls. I glanced at the designer coat hanging on the passenger seat, the neatly wrapped boxes with metallic paper, the insulated bag holding smoked salmon and imported cheeses, things my parents would never buy for themselves. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that something was off this year. I finally cut the engine, grabbed the heavy gift bags, and stepped into the biting air. Snow squeaked under my boots as I made my way up the walk. Through the front window, I could see the lights of the tree blinking in a slow rhythm, casting colored shadows on the walls. The wreath on the door was the same one from my childhood, its plastic berries a little more faded each year. I balanced the pastry box on my hip and nudged the door open with my shoulder, calling out a greeting as the warmth, and the smell of coffee and bacon, rushed up to meet me. Dad was in his usual spot at the head of the dining room table, in an old flannel shirt and worn jeans, a mug in his hand. The television in the living room was turned low, some morning show hosts laughing about last-minute shopping. Mom moved between the kitchen and the table, refilling orange juice and straightening napkins that didn't need straightening. Dad glanced up when I walked in, his eyes doing a quick scan over the bags, my coat, and my boots. Then he gave me a curt nod. "You're cutting it close, Hannah," he said. "We were just about to start without you." I forced a smile, leaned down to hug him, feeling how stiff his shoulders were. I set the pastries on the counter, took off my coat, and walked into the kitchen where Mom was checking something in the oven. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I said, wrapping my arms around her from behind. For a second, she smelled like coffee and the floral lotion she'd used since I was a kid. She patted my hands, but her eyes stayed on the pan she was watching. "You didn't need to bring so much," she said. "I already have plenty of food going." Her tone was light, but there was a little edge there. The same edge I'd heard more and more over the last few years. I told her about the smoked salmon, the fresh pastries from that bakery in Columbus that people at work raved about, the special blend coffee beans I'd ground that morning. She nodded, made a non-committal sound, and shifted the pan. "Sabrina coming later?" I asked. Mom brightened a little. "She said she's on her way. She was up late working on that new project. You know how hard she tries." I bit back the instinctive reply that sat on my tongue, the one about how I also knew something about working hard. Instead, I carried the food into the dining room, arranging everything on the table like I was setting a stage. There were already scrambled eggs, bacon, pancakes, and a bowl of fruit salad. I added my things to the spread, the nice things, the extras that made it feel like a hotel brunch instead of a simple family breakfast. Dad watched me as I worked, his eyes following every dish. "So," he said slowly, "you coming alone this year again? No special someone we should know about?" I pulled up my chair and sat down. "Work has been insane, Dad," I said. "Dating hasn't exactly been a priority." He snorted into his coffee. "Always work with you." Other relatives weren't due until later for a bigger lunch. For now, it was just the three of us. The core of our little storm. I poured myself some coffee, took a breath, and told myself to keep things peaceful for a few hours. It was Christmas morning. I could survive one breakfast. We passed plates and bowls around, forks scraped, the clock ticked on the wall. The television in the next room murmured about a snowstorm in another state. There were small bits of conversation about the weather, about traffic on the highway, about some neighbor who had moved away. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal. Then Dad set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, in that way he had when he was about to steer the conversation where he wanted it. "So," he began, "your mom was telling me you got some big bonus this year." My stomach tightened. "Yeah, the company did well," I said carefully. "It was a good year." He nodded like this confirmed something for him. "That's what I thought." "And yet, when your sister called you about that app idea, you told her no." There it was. The knot in my chest pulled tighter. "Dad," I said, "I told her I couldn't just hand over $20,000 for an idea that isn't fully formed. She doesn't have a plan. There's no developer, no market research." He waved a hand like he was swatting away a fly. "You're the expert, right? You can help her. You sit in those fancy offices making decisions for big companies all day. You can't spare $20,000 for your own sister?" Mom chimed in quietly. "Not looking at me. She's trying so hard, Hannah. She just needs someone to believe in her the way your company believes in you." I put my fork down and laced my fingers together in my lap so they wouldn't shake. "I send thousands every month," I said, keeping my voice even. "I cover the mortgage. I pay the insurance. I've paid for repairs and medical bills and new appliances. I am not withholding help. I am saying that writing a check for a vague idea is not helping." Dad narrowed his eyes. He had that look I knew from childhood, the one he used when he felt challenged. "So, you think the money you send means you get to decide everything now? Paying bills doesn't make you the boss of this family." I felt the words hit a sore spot, like he had pressed a bruise I had been ignoring. "I'm not trying to be the boss," I said. "I'm trying to be responsible." "You know what it sounds like," he said, his voice getting louder. "It sounds like you want credit. You want everyone to clap for you because you send money. Family does not work like that." Mom finally looked up at me, her mouth a thin line. "You've always been so competitive with your sister," she said. "She doesn't have what you have, Hannah. You don't have to rub it in by making her beg." Heat rushed to my face. This was the part that always twisted the knife, the idea that I was somehow proud or cruel for saying no to unreasonable demands, while the years of yes disappeared into a fog no one wanted to see. I took a breath and tried one last time. "I'm not competing with anyone, Mom. I am exhausted. I work long hours every day so that I can take care of myself and still take care of you. I have sent close to $400,000 over the last 8 years. I have skipped vacations. I have put off buying a home of my own. I have let my life shrink so yours could be easier. I am allowed to say no sometimes." For a moment, there was silence. The television droned in the next room. Dad pushed his chair back a little. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mix of anger and something like wounded pride. Then he stood up. He planted his hands on the table and leaned over his plate. His voice dropped, but somehow it carried more than when he had been raising it. "Get out," he said. "Paying bills doesn't buy you a place in this family." The words hung in the air between us. Mom sucked in a breath. My coffee suddenly tasted like ash. My first instinct was disbelief. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that wouldn't come, some sign that he was just blowing off steam. But he just stood there, jaw tight, eyes hard, as if he had finally said something he had been holding for a long time. Mom didn't come to my defense. She shook her head and muttered that I needed to stop envying my sister, that money had gone to my head, that I had forgotten what really mattered. Something in me, something that had been stretched thin for years, just quietly snapped. Not with a scream or a thrown plate, but with a sudden, cold clarity. "All right," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady in a way I didn't feel. "Then pay your own bills." I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped against the worn hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothed the front of my sweater because it gave my hands something to do, and looked at them one last time. Dad was still standing, chest heaving a little. Mom sitting like a statue, eyes bright with angry tears. There was no apology in either of their faces. No hesitation, no flicker of the love I had been chasing with every transfer and every overtime shift. I turned and walked to the front door. The hallways smelled like the pine from the Christmas tree and the faint scent of dust that had always lived in the walls. My boots were by the mat. I pulled them on slowly, feeling how my fingers fumbled with the laces. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me full in the face, sharp and clean. The sky was a little brighter now, a winter sun trying to break through the clouds. Behind me, I could hear muffled voices, but I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't want to. I walked down the cracked steps, across the patchy front yard, and back to my car. My breath moved in and out in short bursts, each one a mix of hurt and something else I couldn't quite name yet. Maybe relief. Maybe grief. Maybe both. Inside the car, I closed the door and let the silence wrap around me. My phone sat in the cup holder, screen lighting up with a text from Sabrina that I didn't open. I picked it up, went to my contacts, and one by one, I blocked the numbers for Dad, for Mom, and for my sister. My thumb hovered for a moment before I hit confirm on the last one. When it was done, an odd stillness settled in my chest. For the first time in years, there were no new demands waiting on the other end of that device. I started the engine, placed my hands on the steering wheel, and stared at the house in the rearview mirror. That little brick box where I had learned what family was supposed to be, and what it had turned into. I put the car in gear without looking back at the front door. At that moment, I honestly thought the worst had already happened. I had no idea that within a day, my dad would call the police on me. But as I pulled out of the cul-de-sac that morning, something deeper began to loosen inside me, something that had been clenched for years. The quiet inside the car felt strangely heavy, like an echo chamber of everything I had given and everything I had tried to ignore. I let the road carry me back toward Columbus while my mind drifted to the beginning, long before I ever imagined being disowned over breakfast on Christmas. I graduated from the University of Michigan in the spring of 2013, stepping across that stage with a cap that barely stayed pinned in place and a heart full of ambition that felt bigger than my body. I landed a junior position at a small fintech startup in Ann Arbor, the kind of place where the office looked like a half-renovated warehouse and everyone drank cheap cold brew from gallon jugs. I was 21 years old, hungry, terrified, and ready to prove myself. My first months were a blur of late nights, endless debugging sessions, and the thrill of solving problems that felt like puzzles only I knew how to unlock. I worked through weekends, slept on the office couch twice, and lived mostly on granola bars and vending machine coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it lit something in me. Something that whispered, "You can make a real life out of this." By 2016, I had moved to Columbus to join Horizon Pay, which at the time was still fighting to be noticed in a crowded market. I started as an entry-level product analyst, happy just to have a desk that didn't wobble and a team that spoke in acronyms I could only pretend to understand. I pushed myself so hard those first years that looking back now, I can barely tell where one project ended and the next began. Around that same time, my parents' finances hit a rough patch. Dad had retired earlier than planned after a shoulder injury, and Mom's hours at the dental clinic fluctuated. I remember Dad calling one night. His voice gruff but edged with embarrassment as he talked about overdue mortgage statements and medical bills stacking up. I told him I could help. It felt like the right thing to do. I was making enough to get by, and helping them seemed simple compared to the stress of work. Then the simple help grew. By the fall of 2016, I was sending them a regular amount each month, somewhere between $3,800 and $4,200. Mortgage, car insurance, home repairs, prescription refills, gas money, small emergencies that cropped up at the worst possible times. By the year 2020, when I was promoted to head of product innovation, my salary and bonuses had climbed close to $500,000 a year. People congratulated me like I had climbed some impossible mountain. But the truth was, I didn't feel rich. I felt like someone trying to hold up two lives with one pair of hands. Every month, I wired the money. Every month, they accepted it with a thank you that grew shorter and shorter until it became an expected routine, almost silent. By the time 8 years passed, the total had drifted just under $400,000. I never kept a spreadsheet for it. Didn't add it up until much later. I just kept giving because I believed that's what a good daughter does. I thought of it as honoring them. I thought of it as gratitude for everything they had done when I was younger. I convinced myself that kindness, when given freely enough, would eventually be seen and appreciated, that it would build connections, that it would soften old wounds I never talked about. But somewhere along the line, what I meant as generosity turned into obligation in their eyes. The tone changed. The words changed. The expectations hardened into something I didn't know how to push back against. Sabrina, 3 years younger than me and always the dreamer of the family, was the first to twist the knife without even meaning to. Whenever a bill stressed her, whenever Dad complained about repairs on the house, she would look at me with that airy laugh of hers and say, "You're the one making all that money. It's no big deal for you." She said it so lightly, as if a few thousand here and there were pennies to me. As if the 16-hour days and the missed holidays and the mounting pressure on my shoulders were invisible. And maybe to her, they were. Sabrina had always floated through life, certain someone would catch her. I had never been given that luxury. There were nights when I sat at my kitchen table in Columbus with a stack of takeout containers pushed aside, staring at my bank statements. Not because I was worried about running out of money, but because I wanted to feel in control of something. But even then, when the numbers felt heavy, I kept sending what they needed. I told myself that love was measured through sacrifice. That carrying the load meant I was strong. That being the dependable one was an honor, not a burden. Looking back now, I see how naive that was. But at the time, it felt noble. It felt like a duty I was meant to shoulder. Even when the requests shifted from needs to wants, I swallowed my hesitation. Dad wanted a newer truck because the old one had a rattle. Mom wanted help replacing a perfectly functional washer and dryer because the deals were good that month. Sabrina wanted money for yet another online business she never followed through on. Each time they phrased it like a small thing, something that would barely make a dent in my income. "You work such long hours," Dad would say. "You deserve to feel proud that you can help." And I would breathe through the tightness in my chest and tell myself he was right. Helping them made me feel useful. It made the bruising workloads and sleepless nights feel less lonely, like all my effort had a greater purpose. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that I had slipped into the role of provider so deeply I didn't know how to climb out. I was not just supporting a family, I was carrying one. Supporting adults who were capable but unwilling to adjust anything in their lives as long as I kept cushioning the fall. Sometimes late at night when the apartment was still and my laptop glowed on the counter with yet another project waiting to be finished, I would wonder when exactly they had stopped thanking me, when the support turned into expectation, when my contributions became invisible. I didn't let myself think about it for long. It felt ungrateful to question it, wrong somehow. The first time I said I couldn't help with something, even though I eventually did, Mom sighed like I had disappointed her on a level deeper than words. And Sabrina, with that soft, almost sweet condescension, had said, "You're making so much more than any of us. Why would you stress about it?" I heard the unspoken truth underneath that, my earnings were not mine, that what I worked for belonged to them first, that my life, as demanding as it was, existed to make theirs comfortable. The years blurred, one transfer after another, until I barely recognized the version of myself who once believed they would appreciate the sacrifices I was making. I kept telling myself that life comes in seasons. Maybe things would change and they would step up again. Maybe we could be a family where love went both ways. But deep down, I think I knew. I think I knew that I was the one holding everything together and that if I ever stopped, even for a moment, everything would crack. And maybe that is why the sting of being told to get out settled so sharply in my chest. It was not just the words. It was the years behind them. The years when I tried to earn a place in a family that had already decided my role for me. Somewhere along the highway that Christmas morning, with snow starting to drift across the lanes and my phone blessedly quiet, for the first time in ages, I finally allowed myself to wonder what would happen if I stopped carrying the weight. I didn't know then that I would soon find out in a way I never expected. That single thought stayed with me as I drove back toward Columbus. The road stretching quiet and pale under the winter sky. Something in me felt unsettled, the way a room feels after someone has slammed a door. It took me back to another uneasiness, one that had begun years earlier, long before Christmas morning exploded the way it did. In early 2022, Dad started texting me with a kind of urgency he had never used before. The water heater is shot. The roof is leaking again. The truck needs a new transmission. Each request arrived with a tone that suggested disaster would strike if I didn't act immediately. I remember sitting at my desk at Horizon Pay, during one of those endless strategy meetings, glancing down at my phone to see Dad's message about a furnace issue, followed by Mom's reassurance that Dad was only trying to secure our future. She told me he was planning ahead so the family would be stable. Her words wrapped the pressure in soft fabric. But the pressure still felt the same. Something about the rhythm of those requests began to feel off. They came too close together. Each one pricier than the last, each one framed as a crisis only I could fix. Still, I pushed the feeling aside. It was easier than questioning motives I didn't want to examine. Then one Sunday afternoon in the fall of that same year, I drove to Cedar Falls for a quick visit. I had brought groceries, new running shoes for Mom, and a toolkit for Dad because he had mentioned wanting to fix the railing on the back porch. I found him in the living room sitting in his recliner with his phone tilted slightly away from me. He was never private with his phone, so the angle caught my attention, but I tried not to read too much into it. I set the groceries on the counter, walked back into the room, and asked how the porch was coming along. As he shifted in the chair, the phone slipped for just a second, turning its screen toward me. I caught a glimpse of an email at the top of his inbox. It had bold letters that read something like "investment contribution confirmed," and a string of numbers beneath it. It blinked into my sight for barely a heartbeat before he snatched the phone closer to his chest, like a teenager caught hiding something. "This is not your business," he snapped, without looking at me. His voice had a defensive edge I had rarely heard from him. I stepped back a little, hands raised, more confused than angry. I said that I wasn't trying to pry, that the email just flashed in front of me. He muttered something under his breath and stood up, leaving the room entirely. Mom brushed past me a minute later with folded laundry in her arms, saying softly that he was working on something big and I should trust him. She said he was preparing for the future of the family and that it was good for all of us. The uneasiness in my stomach twisted a little. I asked her what he was investing in. She gave me a gentle smile and said that Dad knew what he was doing, that I should have more faith and stop worrying. I almost laughed at the irony of being told to stop worrying when I was the one funding most of their stability, but I swallowed it and helped her fold towels instead. Later that evening, Sabrina stopped by, wearing a bright red sweater and talking a mile a minute about some new opportunity. She had heard Dad mention it. She said Dad was finally stepping into his genius, that people never get ahead by playing things safe. She called it a once-in-a-lifetime window and said it was inspiring to see him take risks. Then she looked directly at me and told me that maybe if I loosened up and supported Dad the way a good daughter should instead of acting like a walking calculator, I might understand the excitement. I stared at her, feeling a slow burn gather behind my ribs. I asked her what she knew about the investment. She shrugged and said Dad told her the returns were enormous if he could just get enough initial contributions from a small circle of people. She said he had the kind of mind for this that I never appreciated because I was too rigid. Rigid. Walking calculator. Not supportive enough. I drove back to Columbus that night, replaying her words over and over. Something in her tone had felt almost rehearsed, like she was repeating lines someone had convinced her were true. It disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. Over the next several months, the requests from Dad continued. He needed another $3,000 for unexpected repairs, then another $5,000 for medical expenses, even though Mom's insurance had just been renewed. Then a transfer for what he called a time-sensitive situation. Whenever I asked questions, he grew short with me. When I slowed down even a little, Mom called to soothe me and said he was simply stressed from trying to build something that would support us all. By then I had learned enough through my work in fintech to recognize patterns: money that vanishes without receipts or explanations, sudden urgency, dependency avoidance when questioned. But it is different when the warning signs are attached to the people who raised you. It feels wrong to label them the way you would analyze a stranger's behavior. It feels disloyal. So I avoided the truth for longer than I should have. The turning point came that winter. A few weeks before Christmas, I was sitting at my kitchen island in Columbus, eating a late dinner of cold noodles after a 14-hour day, when Dad texted me after 11 at night. He said he needed $6,000 for a pressing issue. He didn't explain what the issue was. He just said he needed it within 24 hours. Then a minute later, Mom wrote that he was doing all of this for the future and I should be proud. Proud. The word stuck to me like a burr. I sent the transfer because I was too tired to fight. But I couldn't shake the image of that email on his phone. The bright words about an investment contribution that he insisted was not my business. Little by little, I began to track the dates of his requests, not the amounts, not the totals, just the pattern. And as I looked at the dates lined up one after another, a quiet realization began to surface. The money I was sending every month did not seem to be going toward the mortgage or the roof or the truck or medical bills. The timing had no correlation with anything I could identify. It lined up only with his vague emergencies and his increasing secrecy. I felt foolish even thinking about it. But I had to admit to myself that the money might be going somewhere I had no control over and no knowledge of. Somewhere risky. Somewhere dangerous. And yet I still had no proof, no receipts, no explanations, only the feeling that something was not right. I told myself that families go through complicated phases. I told myself that stress makes people act oddly. I told myself that Dad had earned the right to make his own choices, even if I didn't understand them. But the truth was louder than all those excuses. I was sending thousands each month, and I didn't know what it was being used for. I was carrying a household that was not telling me the truth. That realization sat with me on my long drives, on my late nights at work, on the mornings when I opened my bank app before I had even brushed my teeth. It deepened the uneasiness into something more solid, something that whispered a warning in the back of my mind. Even when I tried to ignore it. By the time Christmas morning arrived, I already sensed that something was shifting underneath the surface of our family. I just didn't know how close everything was to breaking. I carried that realization with me into the fall of 2024. The leaves in Cedar Falls began turning that deep burnt orange that always made the whole town feel quieter than it actually was. By then, the tension in my chest had become a constant companion. I felt it even in my office at Horizon Pay, when I was surrounded by whiteboards and prototypes instead of my family's problems. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, that maybe Dad really was planning something for the future. But truthfully, I was bracing for whatever would come next. It arrived one Saturday in late September. I had driven to Cedar Falls for a short visit, mostly because guilt still tugged at me even when I tried to ignore it. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Dad sitting on the front porch with Raymond Cole, our neighbor from 2 houses down. Raymond was a gentleman in his early 60s who taught biology at the local high school for decades before retiring. He had always been friendly to me, helping shovel our walkway when I was a kid, handing me lemonade in the summer. Seeing him sitting so close to Dad, with a serious look on his face, made me slow my steps as I walked toward them. Dad was leaning in with the same eager tone he used whenever he talked about something he believed would change his life. He was showing Raymond something on his phone. Raymond looked uneasy but curious, the way people look when they want hope more than caution. Dad didn't notice me at first. He was saying something about tripling returns in 60 days and early investor windows closing soon. My stomach clenched. I stepped closer and asked what was going on. Dad shot me an irritated look, as if I had interrupted something important. He said he was discussing an opportunity with Raymond, something that could finally give the family a financial cushion. Raymond offered me a polite smile, but it looked forced. He said Dad had told him about a new investment group with incredible growth potential. He said he was thinking about putting some savings into it. I asked him how much he was considering, and he said around $8,000. The number made my breath catch. I asked Dad how he knew this group, who verified the projections, what platform they used, whether they were registered with any oversight. He brushed me off and told Raymond not to worry, saying, my job made me overly cautious and that I didn't understand how wealth was made outside corporate walls. He even gave a small laugh, like I was being dramatic. The laugh stung more than it should have. Later that afternoon, I found Mom in the kitchen stirring a pot of chili. I said that schemes promising tripled returns in 60 days were almost always fraudulent. She barely looked at me, only saying that Dad knew what he was doing and that he had been researching this for months. I asked what kind of research. She paused just long enough to make it clear she didn't know, then said I shouldn't undermine his confidence. I pushed a little harder, telling her that people get scammed every day, that it wasn't just risky, but illegal in some cases. She stopped stirring and turned toward me with a look I hadn't seen from her since my teenage years. She told me sharply not to ruin something good for Dad, and that he finally felt excited about the future. I felt my throat tighten. I asked her if she even knew where the money he was investing came from. Her only answer was that it was family business and that I should trust him. Trust, that word again. It felt misplaced in a conversation where no one was telling me the truth. Before I left that evening, Sabrina stopped by with a big smile, leaning against the counter like she was the host of some financial talk show. She said Dad had been sharing his plans with her and that he had a brilliant mind for spotting opportunities. She said I was trying to clip his wings because I was jealous of how close they had become over this project. I asked her if she knew anything about the details of the investment. She said no, but that the numbers spoke for themselves. She said people who think small miss the wave. I drove back to Columbus with a heavy feeling, one that settled deeper with each passing mile. I wanted so badly to believe Dad was simply chasing something optimistic, but hope does not erase math, and nothing about this sounded real. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Raymond. His voice shook slightly. He said he put in the $8,000 and now couldn't reach the investor portal at all. He asked if I had a minute to look at something. I pulled my laptop onto the kitchen island while he spoke. He forwarded me screenshots. My heart sank. They were classic signs of a fraudulent operation. No disclosures, no legal documentation, no contact information beyond a generic email address. The projected returns were numbers no legitimate investment would promise. I told him to contact the Economic Crimes Unit immediately. He hesitated, not wanting to get Dad in trouble. I told him this wasn't about Dad, but about protecting his savings. The next day, he filed a report. A week after that, an investigator from the Economic Crimes Unit called me, asking if I was aware of any financial activity involving my family. The tone was formal, but probing. I told him I only knew enough to be worried. He said the report mentioned Dad's name as someone who encouraged the investment. They were opening a case, but lacked enough data to move forward. They needed more evidence. He asked if I would notify them if I found anything unusual. I said yes, even though the agreement left me feeling uneasy. I hung up and sat in silence at my kitchen table. It was the first moment I allowed myself to admit what I had been avoiding. The money I had been sending for 8 years was not going where I thought it was. And Dad was not just investing, he was recruiting. I drove to Cedar Falls the following weekend, hoping to talk to Mom calmly, hoping she would see what was happening. I sat across from her in the living room, telling her everything I learned from Raymond, telling her that the police were now involved. She crossed her arms and said Raymond misunderstood. She said Dad had everything under control. When I said police units don't open cases without cause, her voice tightened. She told me Dad was trying to build something meaningful, and that I needed to stop sabotaging him. She said I was the negative one, the one who always doubted them. I felt something in my chest crack a little. I told her that I was worried this could pull the whole family down. She looked away and said it was time I stopped acting like the only responsible adult in the house. There it was. The illusion I had carried for years, shattered in 7 seconds. On the drive home that night, the highway felt darker than usual. The kind of darkness that reflects what you don't want to see. I kept replaying everything, the secrecy, the evasions, the way Mom and Sabrina defended him without understanding a single detail. The way Dad reacted when I asked questions. The way Raymond's voice trembled when he told me he had lost his savings. For the first time, I wasn't just uneasy. I was afraid. Afraid that I had been fueling something far bigger than a family misunderstanding. Afraid that I had unknowingly bankrolled a disaster. By the time Columbus came into view, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I had not just been supporting my parents, I had been keeping alive a recklessness that threatened to swallow all of us whole. And now, with an investigation stirring and neighbors losing money and Dad pulling more people in, I could feel it gathering speed. The fear settled deeper inside me as I parked that night. It stayed with me through the fall, through the early snowfalls, through the endless meetings at Horizon Pay, where my mind drifted again and again to Cedar Falls. By the time Christmas approached, I felt like I was holding my breath without knowing why. Still, I told myself I could handle one holiday breakfast. I could show up, bring gifts, keep the peace, and get through it the way I always had. I clung to that thought. Even though something in my gut was already warning me that nothing about this Christmas would be normal. I woke early on Christmas morning, before the sky even hinted at dawn. I moved around my apartment, packing things into the back seat of my car. There were wrapped boxes tied with gold ribbon, a basket containing smoked salmon and fresh pastries, bottles of maple syrup, and a soft wool sweater I had picked out for Mom. I wanted the morning to feel warm, even if the year leading up to it had been anything but. The drive to Cedar Falls felt longer than usual. Snow lined the roads, and the air outside had the kind of cold that makes everything brittle. When I turned into my parents' neighborhood, the Christmas lights on the houses glowed faintly through the haze of frost. I parked in the same place I had parked every year since college, grabbed the gifts, and walked toward the front steps, feeling both exhausted and strangely hopeful. Inside, the house smelled like bacon and cinnamon. The tree lights blinked softly. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal as I unpacked the pastries and set them on the table. Mom thanked me absently. Dad sat at the head of the table, watching me like he was waiting for something. I tried to ignore the way my pulse jumped when I looked at him. Then Sabrina walked in through the front door, stamping snow off her boots. She kissed Mom on the cheek, hugged Dad, and glanced at me with a smile that was too bright for the hour. She held a folder in her hand, its edges bristling with color-coded tabs. Perfect timing, she said. I want to show you both something. I felt a familiar weariness rise from somewhere deep. She laid the folder on the dining table, opened it with a dramatic flourish, and announced that she had put together a pitch deck for her fitness app. She had chosen a name, designed a logo, and typed up a description in a bold font. There were screenshots of mock-ups she had built using a free online template. She talked fast, explaining her vision as if it were already breaking into the market. Dad leaned forward, puffed with pride. This is what I'm talking about, he said. This is real potential. Your sister is chasing something meaningful. She just needs someone to back her. Then his eyes moved to me, steady and expectant. I opened the folder and scanned a few pages. The app didn't have a defined audience. The revenue model was wishful thinking at best. The market research was a single paragraph copied from a wellness blog. I set the folder down gently. Sabrina, I said, this is a start, but it's not ready for investment. There's no plan here, no development team, no timeline, no budget. You cannot ask for $20,000 without even the basics. Her expression tightened. So you're saying no again? I breathed out slowly. I'm saying you need more preparation. I am not funding something that is not built. You need to do the work first. To my surprise, it was Dad who reacted first. His coffee mug hit the table hard enough to slush liquid over the sides. He glared at me like I had insulted him, not Sabrina. You're doing it again, he said. Kill her dreams. Because you think you know better. You sit in your fancy office and decide who succeeds and who fails. Families are supposed to support each other. I kept my voice calm. I have been supporting this family for 8 years. I have given everything you asked for. But this is not a business plan. It is a sketch. Dad's face reddened. He leaned forward, anger rolling off him. You think sending money means you get to control us? You're stopping your sister from building a future. That's what you're doing. Mom looked up from the stove just long enough to add, she worked so hard, Hannah. You shouldn't make her feel small. I blinked hard. Make her feel small. The irony stung so sharply I felt it behind my eyes. I reminded myself to stay steady. Dad pointed at me. Just give her $20,000. You can afford it. You make more in a month than we used to make in half a year. Stop acting like it hurts you. The frustration, the buried resentment, the exhaustion from years of constant giving rose all at once. I felt it like a tide pulling something inside me loose. My voice wavered only slightly when I said, I have given too much already. I am tired, Dad. I cannot keep doing this. I need you to stand on your own feet. Silence hit the room like cold air from an open door. Dad stared at me with an intensity one had only seen a few times in my life. Something in his expression hardened. He stood up slowly, palms pressing flat against the table. His eyes narrowed in a way that made my entire body go still. Get out, he said. Paying bills doesn't buy you a place in this family. Mom gasped softly. Sabrina looked confused for half a second and then glanced away. I looked at Dad, trying to understand whether he meant it, but he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't soften. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly like thin ice giving way under your foot. All right, I said. I understand. I pushed back my chair. My legs felt strangely steady, even though I knew something was breaking inside me. I walked into the living room, picked up my coat from the arm of the sofa, and slid it on with careful movements. I felt the weight of silence behind me. No one followed. No one called my name. I walked past the Christmas tree, past the garland Mom had hung over the doorway, past the photos lining the hallway walls, all the small pieces that were once home. Outside, the winter air struck my face like a warning. My breath came out in white puffs. My boots crunched over the snow. As I crossed the yard, I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. When I reached my car, I didn't cry. I sat behind the wheel, stared at the house for one long moment, and felt two opposite sensations at once. My heart was breaking, and underneath the pain was a lightness I didn't recognize. A strange, thin ribbon of relief. I had hit my limit. I had finally said no. As I backed out of the driveway, the house shrank in my rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a row of tall pines. No one came out the door. No one waved. No one tried. The road ahead looked cold and unfamiliar, but it was mine. I drove away from Cedar Falls with shaking hands, not realizing that the silence from my family was not the end of the story at all. It was only the beginning of the fallout that would come next. I didn't sleep much that night. After I got back to Columbus, I showered, made tea I didn't drink, and sat on my couch with a blanket around my shoulders. While the city outside went quiet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad at the table, his hands flat on the wood, his voice telling me to get out. Somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking to the sound of my phone buzzing on the coffee table. The light coming through the blinds was thin and gray. I blinked, reached for the phone, and saw an unfamiliar number. For a second, I almost let it go to voicemail. Something in my chest said, "Answer it," so I did. A calm male voice introduced himself as Officer Grant Holloway with the Economic Crimes Unit out of Indiana. He said he was calling to verify a report that had been filed related to family financial support and possible neglect of elderly parents. At first, the words didn't land. They just floated there like he was speaking a language I hadn't learned. Then my brain caught up. I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. I asked him slowly who had filed the report. There was a brief pause. Then he said that my father, Robert Mercer, had contacted local law enforcement, who then passed information along regarding potential financial exploitation. For a moment, I genuinely thought he had misspoke. I let out a shaky laugh that sounded wrong in my own ears and told him there had to be some mistake. He said he understood this might be upsetting and that he wasn't accusing me of anything, only following protocol. He needed to hear my side and see any relevant information. He asked if I could come in that afternoon since I was listed as living in Columbus and it would be easier to coordinate with my schedule. I agreed because what else could I do? When I hung up, the room felt tilted. I sat there staring at the blank television screen, my phone still in my hand, the word exploitation echoing in my head. Dad had not only told me to leave, he had turned me into a suspect in a story he was telling the authorities. He had taken everything I had done for them and twisted it into something ugly. It took a few minutes before my brain fully kicked into gear. When it did, it went straight into work mode. I stood up, put the phone down, and went to my home office. I opened my laptop, logging into my bank accounts, my email, my cloud storage. If they wanted records, I would give them records. For the next couple of hours, I pulled statements, month after month of transfers from me to my parents, mortgage payments I had set up from my accounts directly to their lender, transactions for utilities, insurance premiums, car notes, individual transfers labeled as help or health or emergency. I saved them into a folder, then into a second backup, printing some out because paper in a file sometimes speaks louder. Then, screen by screen, I scrolled back through 8 years of message threads where Dad had asked for money, notes from Mom telling me he was under stress, little thank yous that grew sparse as time went on. I flagged the ones that showed amounts and reasons. There were so many. Looking at them all together like that made my throat tighten. I pulled out the messages where I had tried to warn them about the investment. I had a feeling those would come up another way. By early afternoon, I was sitting in a small, windowless interview room at a downtown station. A manila folder on the table in front of me. The walls were painted a tired beige, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Officer Holloway walked in with a tablet and a legal pad. He was in his mid-40s, his dark hair going silver near his temples. His manner was steady in a way that made me feel both nervous and a little safer. He introduced himself again, thanked me for coming in, and reminded me that I was not under arrest, that this was an information-gathering conversation. Those words eased me only slightly. He started with simple questions: my full name, age, job title, where I lived, how often I saw my parents. Then he asked when I had begun helping them financially. I told him about the call from Dad back in 2016 when the mortgage had fallen behind and the medical bills were piling up. I said I had started with a few months of help and that it grew from there into something regular. He asked me to describe regular. I told him that for years I had sent between $3,800 and $4,200 each month. Sometimes more when unexpected things came up. His eyebrows rose a little at the numbers. He asked if I had documentation. I slid the folder toward him. Inside were printed summaries and a drive with digital copies. He took his time flipping through the pages, his eyes moving line by line. He asked if there had been any formal agreement. I said no. There was no contract, no promise of repayment. It was family help. I said that phrase quietly, hearing how thin it sounded in that small room. He nodded, made a note on his pad, then asked about my work. I told him I was the head of product innovation at Horizon Pay, and that my income was high on paper. I also told him that I worked 14 to 16 hours a day, most days, including weekends, and that the stress was not something I would wish on anyone. I wanted him to understand that the money my parents saw as easy did not fall out of the sky. Then he asked the question that lodged itself in my bones: did I feel I had ever withheld resources they needed for basic care? The air in the room felt very still. I took a moment before answering, because I wanted my voice to hold. I told him that I had never refused to help with things like utilities, medical costs, or the mortgage. That when I said no, it was about extra things: business schemes, new cars when the old ones were still functional, projects my sister dreamed up that had no structure. I heard myself say, I have worked myself raw for 8 years to keep them comfortable. I have sent close to $400,000 in that time without asking for anything in writing, without ever being repaid. And the truth is, I have no idea where a lot of that money went. He looked up sharply at that. He asked me what I meant. So I told him about the late-night requests, the vague emergencies, the email on Dad's phone with an investment confirmation. I told him about Raymond calling me, about the screenshots of the suspicious portal, about my conversation with Mom where she said I was trying to ruin something good for Dad. He didn't interrupt often. When he did, it was to ask for dates, for amounts, for names. I answered as precisely as I could. The more I spoke, the more surreal the whole thing felt. Part of me was in that chair, watching his hand move across the page. Part of me was floating somewhere above us, looking down at a woman who had been carrying too much for too long. After I finished, he sat back a little and studied me. He said that the initial report from my father painted a very different picture. In that version, I had cut off all support without warning, kept control of accounts that belonged to them, and left them struggling. The words stung, even though I knew they weren't true. I told him that the only thing I had cut off was myself. That I had blocked their numbers after being told by my own dad that paying bills doesn't make me family. I said I had not touched any accounts in their names. I had simply stepped out of the role I had been forced into. He nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted, a small tightening around his eyes. He said I had provided a lot of information that did not match the narrative he had been given. He told me there had already been a complaint from another party, Raymond Cole, regarding a suspected fraudulent investment connected loosely to my father. And now, with my records, there were new patterns to examine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the air vents sounded strangely loud. He tapped his pen once on the pad, then set it down. He said he was going to keep my documentation and compare it carefully with the other case files. He might need to ask me more questions later, but for now, he had enough. He thanked me for my cooperation and said he understood this could not be easy. When he stood, I did too. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He opened the door and walked me back through the hallway, past desks and bulletin boards, to the reception area. He told me I was free to go and that I should not contact my father about this conversation. For the time being, it's better to let the process unfold. Outside, the winter air wrapped around me, thin and biting. I walked to my car with the kind of careful steps you take after a fall, when your body isn't sure yet what's broken. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were trembling. Part of me wanted to believe that the officer had seen the truth. That he understood I was not the villain in this story. Another part of me couldn't get past the fact that my dad had put me in a position where I had to defend myself to law enforcement at all. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed with a new message. I didn't look at it. I kept my eyes on the road and my thoughts on the folder now sitting in an evidence room, a folder full of years of transfers and messages and silent sacrifices. For the first time, I was not only questioning where my money had gone, I was questioning who my dad had chosen to become. I drove home with that question circling in my head, and it followed me through the next 2 days like a shadow I couldn't shake. By the third morning, my nerves were frayed enough that the sound of my email notification made my stomach twist. It was from Officer Holloway. He asked if I could confirm a few dates regarding transfers I had made in 2022 and 2023. They were small requests, easy to answer, but the precision of his questions told me something had shifted on his end. Later that afternoon, he called. His voice was steady but carried a new weight, as if the puzzle he had been studying finally clicked into place. He said he had compared the statements I provided with the complaint filed by Raymond Cole. He also mentioned a second complaint that had recently been forwarded to their division without giving me names. He said both involved the same investment portal Dad had shown me, and the timelines and amounts overlapped almost perfectly with the transfers I had made to my parents. Money leaves my account, goes into my parents' account, then into the portal tied to the scam. After that, small commission payments trickled back to Dad. Hearing it stated plainly made something in my chest pull tight. I had not been paranoid or overthinking, the pattern was there, undeniable. He said the unit now had reasonable suspicion to expand the investigation. They needed to question my father in person, verify his statements, and document any inconsistencies. I felt a sharp pain in my ribs at the word inconsistencies. I knew exactly what those were going to look like. The next morning, I sat in my car outside my office, my phone on the passenger seat. I was supposed to be preparing for a strategy presentation, but all I could think about was that Holloway was on his way to Cedar Falls. I imagined him parking in front of the split-level house. I imagined Dad stepping onto the porch with that short fuse he had learned to disguise as confidence. Midday, my phone buzzed with a single line from Holloway, "Contact made, will update later." My hands went cold. I could picture the scene as if a camera were moving through their doorway right then. He told me later what happened. But even as he described it, I could see it clearly. He pulled up at the house, walked up the front path, and before he knocked, the door opened. Dad stood there like he had been waiting to play the role of the injured party. He puffed out his chest, and said something loud enough for the neighbors to hear, probably that he was glad someone was finally taking his complaint seriously, probably that daughters these days had no respect. But whatever he expected, it was not what came next. Holloway identified himself and asked if he could come in to ask a few questions regarding financial activity. Dad waved him inside with exaggerated authority, looking around as if waiting for more officers to show up behind him. Mom sat on the love seat with her hands clasped, her posture tight. Sabrina was perched on the arm of the couch, her expression alert, ready to join the performance. Once inside, Holloway started with general questions, the kind that feel harmless until they're not. How long had my parents been receiving financial help from me? Dad crossed his arms and said I had never supported them consistently, that he had begged me for assistance and been denied, that I had withheld what belonged to him. He said it plainly, like he was reciting lines he had rehearsed. Holloway asked if he had records of these requests or of any contribution he claimed I owed. Dad's eyes narrowed. He muttered something about daughters not needing receipts to treat their parents right. Sabrina chimed in that I made $500,000 a year and could easily afford to help if I cared. Holloway noted that comment, then asked Sabrina if she had ever repaid any of the support she had received over the years. Her mouth opened, closed again. Then she said it was irrelevant. He asked Dad to explain the deposits that had entered his account from mine. Dad said those were rare and insufficient. Then Holloway asked about the transfers from Dad's account into the investment portal linked to the scams reported by the neighbors. The room shifted. Then Dad's eyebrows twitched. He laughed stiffly and said it was a misunderstanding. He said he had only put in small amounts, that he had been told it was a high return opportunity, and he had every right to invest the money his daughter refused to provide. It made no sense even on the surface. Sabrina tried to jump in, saying she had seen Dad's numbers and that everything was legitimate. Her voice had that familiar edge, the one she used when she wanted to sound smarter than she was. Holloway asked her if she had invested as well. She hesitated just slightly, then said no, but she had planned to once the prototype for her app was complete. It was unraveling. In slow motion. The more they tried to explain, the thinner their story became. Holloway asked Dad to clarify why his statements contradicted the records I had submitted. Dad grew agitated, raising his voice. He pointed toward the door, as if I might appear there to defend myself, and insisted that I had been withholding funds. He said he knew I made enough to take care of them properly. Holloway asked him again where the money I had already sent had gone. Dad snapped back with something about business opportunities and protecting the family's future. It was almost the same line he had used on me, but this time it collapsed under the weight of evidence. He couldn't give dates. Couldn't explain the amounts, couldn't reconcile the commission payments that had come back into his account. Mom finally spoke. Her voice was small, but it had a tremor running under it. She asked why the officer had mentioned other people. She asked what neighbors had to do with any of this. When Holloway said the name Raymond, she winced slightly, like a crack had opened in the foundation she was standing on. She asked if this was serious. He told her calmly that it was. The living room went still. Sabrina looked at Mom, then back at the officer, confusion flickering over her face. Dad's jaw flexed, and for the first time, he didn't have a quick answer ready. His confidence faltered. Holloway closed his notebook. He told Dad he needed to step outside so they could speak privately. He said the conversation involved ongoing investigation details, and it could not continue in the presence of others. For a moment, Dad didn't move. Then he stood with a stiffness that made the air in the room tighten. He walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last, like he could feel the weight of the scrutiny that had finally reached him. When the door closed behind them, and the cold winter light spilled across the carpet, something shifted in the house on Maple Ridge Drive. The story they had been telling themselves for years no longer held. And whether they admitted it out loud yet or not, everything that followed would be shaped by what was said on that front lawn. What was said on that front lawn did not reach me in real time. I didn't stand behind the curtains and watch the scene unfold. I pieced it together later from two different sources, from the careful report that Officer Holloway gave me, and from the more raw version my Aunt Marlene shared when she called that night, her voice still unsteady from what she had seen. The afternoon it happened, I was at my apartment in Columbus, sitting at my kitchen table with my work laptop open, pretending to focus on a product roadmap while my mind drifted 100 miles away. The winter light outside was thin and colorless. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to ring with some new twist. When it stayed silent, the silence felt heavier, not lighter. At some point, without my knowing it, a patrol car and an unmarked sedan pulled up in front of my parents' house. The engines cut off, and the sound of tires on packed snow faded. Curtains twitched in neighboring windows. In small towns like Cedar Falls, unexpected police presence spreads through a street faster than any holiday gossip. Inside the house, Mom and Sabrina sat stiffly on the couch where Holloway had left them. The television was on but muted, the images of a daytime talk show flickering across their faces. When the front door opened again and cold air swept into the hallway, they rose almost in unison and moved toward the window. Holloway and Dad were standing on the front walk. The officer had his hands relaxed at his sides. Dad had his stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders hunched, chin jutted out in that defiant way I knew too well. The neighbors across the street had stepped out onto their own porches. Everyone was watching. Holloway spoke first, his voice calm, but carrying. He told Dad that based on the financial records, the complaints from 2 separate households, and the pattern of transfers, the unit needed to treat him as a subject in an active investigation. He used the kind of measured language that comes with training, but the meaning was clear enough that even distant ears could understand. Then he said the 4 words that would echo around that cul-de-sac for weeks: "You are under investigation." There were no dramatic handcuffs in that moment. No shouting of rights. It wasn't an arrest on a television show. It was something quieter, and in its own way, harsher. It was the official stripping away of the story Dad had been telling about being the victim. Aunt Marlene, who had pulled her car to the curb just in time to see it, said Dad went pale for a heartbeat. Then his face flushed deep red. He pointed angrily toward the house, toward the window where he knew Mom and Sabrina were standing, and he raised his voice so that half the block could hear. "This is your fault," he told Holloway. "And by your, he meant me. Even though I wasn't there. My daughter did this. She has been trying to destroy this family for years. She twisted things. She made me look like a criminal." Hearing that secondhand still made my stomach clench. It wasn't enough for him to deny his own choices. He needed to cast me as the destroyer, the traitor, the one who had taken a knife to the image he wanted to preserve. Holloway, from what he later told me, didn't flinch. He said that whatever history existed between me and my family was not his concern. What mattered were the facts, and the facts as he saw them painted a very different picture. He told Dad that I did not owe him or Mom any financial obligation under the law, that adult children in this country are not required to support their parents. He said I had provided extensive documentation of voluntary support over many years, with no sign that I had ever misused their accounts or withheld their own funds. He also said this, that my responsibility ended where his began. But while I didn't owe Dad anything, Dad did have a responsibility to answer for the money he had accepted from neighbors and friends, money he had funneled into an unlicensed investment structure with promises of tripled returns in 60 days, money that had already vanished for at least 2 families. Aunt Marlene said she could see Mom through the window when those words carried up the walk. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Her shoulders sank. Whatever she had been telling herself about Dad's secret big plan cracked right down the middle. About the commissions, Marlene said she had known Dad was excited. She had known he talked about recruiting a few people, but she had not known that every time someone else put money in, a little bit came back to him, probably marked as referral bonus or performance incentive or some other friendly name. Hearing the words out loud, hearing that Dad had already been paid while others lost their savings, made something inside her buckle. She pushed open the front door and stepped onto the porch, calling out that this was a misunderstanding, that Dad would never hurt anyone. Her voice cracked halfway through. Holloway turned toward her, his expression not unkind. He told her firmly that this conversation needed to stay between him and her father for the moment. He suggested gently that she go back inside. She did, but not before her eyes filled. Marlene said Dad was talking, his words tumbling over one another. He said he had been trying to build something that would finally give his family a comfortable life. He said he had trusted the wrong people, that he was just another victim. He tried to redirect blame, to cloud the trail. He insisted he had only ever used his own funds, that any appearance of my money being involved was a coincidence. Holloway listened. Then he referred to exact dates and amounts. He noted the transfer from my account to Dad's on one day, followed by the transfer to the investment account the next. He mentioned the commission deposits that came back into Dad's account shortly after new participants joined. He said that while some details were still under review, the pattern was enough that he could not ignore it. That was when the fight went out of Dad's posture just a little. His shoulders sagged. His mouth kept moving, but the words began to lose shape. He sounded less like a man in control and more like someone trying to hold on to a story that no longer fit the evidence. Mom stepped out onto the porch then, arms wrapped around herself despite the coat she wore. She asked, her voice thin, if this meant Dad could go to jail. Marlene said she had never heard Mom sound so small. Holloway didn't promise any outcome. He told her that there would be further questioning at the station, that they needed a clearer picture of Dad's role. He reiterated that the investigation was ongoing and that they were still determining whether he was primarily a victim, an active participant, or both. The words hung in the cold air: victim, participant, both. Finally, Holloway told Dad that they were going to escort him to the station for a formal interview. He said it in that carefully neutral tone officers use when they want to prevent things from escalating. Dad looked around, taking in the neighboring eyes, the half-drawn curtains. He muttered something about this being humiliating. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, he repeated that it was my doing, my betrayal. My choice to take their dirty laundry to strangers. He made it sound like I had marched him up to the chopping block myself. Holloway didn't respond to that part. He and the second officer guided Dad toward the unmarked car. They didn't touch him roughly, didn't shove him. They simply walked him down the path he had cleared himself, step by step, over months and years. The car door closed with a soft, final sound. The engine started. The vehicles pulled away slowly from the curb. Behind them, the house on Maple Ridge stood with its front door still slightly ajar and its wreath hanging crooked, like someone had grabbed it without thinking. Inside, Mom sat on the nearest chair and stared at her hands. Sabrina paced, then stopped, then paced again. The phone began to buzz with messages from relatives and neighbors who were not nearly as subtle as they thought they were. By the time Aunt Marlene called me that evening, the news had already traveled farther than that single street. She told me what she had seen, her words tumbling out in a mix of anger and sorrow. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should have spoken up sooner when she saw how much I was carrying. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my own kitchen, miles away, but suddenly feeling the crack in our family's image as if it had happened in the room with me. For years, we had been the Mercers, the steady family at the end of Maple Ridge, with a nice yard and the hardworking parents. Now that picture was gone. Whatever we had been to the town, to the extended family, even to ourselves, had changed. The man who once walked into that house smelling like motor oil and pride after long shifts was now a name in an economic crimes file. The woman who told herself her husband was just stressed was now grappling with the reality that he had taken money from people who trusted him. And the daughter who had poured her earnings into keeping them afloat was suddenly something else too. I was no longer simply the provider in the background. I had become the witness whose truth had helped pull the curtain back. By the end of that day, the Mercers were not just a family in trouble. We were a story people told in lowered voices at kitchen tables all over Cedar Falls. A story about money and pride, and what happens when the lies finally meet the truth. The story spread through Cedar Falls faster than I ever imagined. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my last name had already turned into a kind of whispered caution, a cautionary tale. I didn't know any of that when I woke up in my apartment in Columbus, but I felt an unfamiliar heaviness in my chest, as if something had been carved out and left empty. Later that afternoon, while I was sorting through product feedback at my kitchen counter, an email notification appeared from the Economic Crimes Unit. My breath caught when I saw Officer Holloway's name. I opened it immediately. His message was concise, written in a tone that felt almost gentle. He confirmed that after reviewing all financial records, statements, and interviews, I was not considered a subject in the case. I was officially categorized as an uninvolved party, and more specifically, as someone who had been financially manipulated by a family member. My eyes blurred at the last part. It was one thing to know deep down that I had been used. It was another thing to see it typed out by an investigator who had no reason to soften the truth. I read the email twice before closing my laptop, pressing my palms against the cool surface, and letting out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 8 years. But relief is a strange feeling. It doesn't land cleanly. It comes tangled with grief, anger, guilt, and a kind of numbness you don't expect. I knew I needed help making sense of all of it. So that week, I booked my first therapy appointment. I found a counselor named Lynn, who had the kind of warm, steady voice that made it easier to let words come out of places I had kept locked away. She listened as I explained the years of support, the exhaustion, the pressure, the guilt. She nodded when I described how love had slowly turned into obligation until I could no longer tell the difference. During our third session, she said something that stayed with me. She told me that survival patterns often look like generosity, that when children grow into the emotional role their parents abandon, they begin to believe that love must be earned through sacrifice. I sat with that for a long time, staring at the tissue in my hand, realizing that for most of my adult life, I had not been giving freely. I had been paying for a seat at a table that never had space for me. That realization made it easier to begin setting boundaries, though easier did not mean painless. Sabrina called me 4 times in one evening. The first voicemail was frantic, her voice shaking. She said she never meant to hurt me, that everything had gotten out of hand, that Dad was just overwhelmed. She said they all missed me and needed me back. The second voicemail was sharper, as if she had convinced herself in those few minutes that she was the injured one. She accused me of abandoning the family when they needed stability. The third was tearful again. The fourth was almost silent. I saved none of them. Mom sent messages. Short ones at first, then longer. She said she was sorry I'd been dragged into the investigation. She said she didn't know how bad things had gotten. She said she needed her daughter back. For a moment, I almost replied, the old instinct to fix things tugging at my hand. But then I remembered Lynn's words. Remembered the 8 years of running myself ragged to keep a sinking ship afloat. And I put my phone face down on the table. Some guilt remained. I could feel it tightening my chest occasionally, like a reflex I hadn't yet unlearned. But for the first time, I saw it clearly for what it was, a chain. And if a chain can be recognized, it can be cut. Around the same time I began therapy, I forced myself to re-enter the world outside of work. One night, I attended a fintech networking mixer in Chicago, something I normally skipped because it felt more like a chore than a break. This time, I told myself I needed it, not for my career, but for my humanity. The room buzzed with conversations and clinking glasses. People in tech tend to speak quickly, as if ideas might evaporate if not shared fast enough. I drifted through small groups, half listening to discussions about emerging payment structures and regulatory updates, until someone approached me with a quiet smile. He introduced himself as Michael Tate. He said he had heard me speak at a conference last year and had been hoping for a chance to meet me. His voice was calm, steady, not rushed. His presence felt like stepping out of a crowded hallway into open air. We talked about work, but also about stress, burnout, long hours, and how strange it is to feel successful on paper while being exhausted to the bone. There was no pressure in the conversation, no angle, no expectation, just a kind of kindness I had not realized I had been starved for. At one point, he said he admired how driven I was, but he hoped I was taking time for myself, too. The words were simple, but something in me loosened at hearing them. It had been so long since anyone cared about my well-being rather than my availability. When the event ended, he asked if he could walk me out. We stepped into the cold Chicago night, our breaths visible in the air, and he held the door without making it feel like a statement. For a moment, I wondered if this was what it felt like not to carry the weight of everyone else's needs. To just exist in a moment that belonged to me. Driving home that night, I felt a quiet shift inside. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a slow, steady realization that I didn't have to remain an extension of someone else's crisis. I could be a person with her own needs, her own life, her own boundaries. And once I knew that, I also knew something else. I was never going back to being the Mercer family's silent ATM. I had stepped into something even more important, a life that was finally mine. Snow was falling outside my apartment window the morning the calendar flipped into the second week of January. Soft, steady flakes drifted past the glass, melting along the sill. Columbus looked muted and peaceful under that light. It struck me how long it had been since winter felt anything close to peaceful. The last 8 years of holidays had carried a kind of weight that settled on my shoulders long before the season ever arrived. This time, the weight was gone, replaced by something quiet and still, like the pause after a deep breath. I was sitting at my dining table with a cup of tea when my email notification sounded. For a moment, my chest tightened. Even after Holloway's last update clearing me, some part of me still braced whenever his name appeared. I opened the message. His tone was as steady as always. He explained that the investigation was now expanding into the recruitment aspect of the scam, that additional complaints had come forward, and that Dad might be held responsible for soliciting participants, even if he had initially believed the investment was legitimate. The wording was careful, but the meaning was clear. Things were not resolving quietly for him. I read the email twice, letting the realities sink in. There was no relief in knowing my dad might face consequences. Not in the sense people often expect. What I felt instead was clarity. For years, I'd been tangled in the illusion that if I just did more, gave more, loved more, he would choose me. That illusion had cracked the moment he turned me into a suspect to protect himself. And now the truth unfolded through official channels. I felt something lift inside me. Not joy, not triumph, just the absence of burden. I closed the laptop gently and rested my hands on the table. The apartment was warm, quiet, lived in. My home. Not a way station between crises, not a vault for my family's emergencies. Just a space that held only what I chose to let in. My phone buzzed. For a split second, I wondered if it would be another unfamiliar number I needed to avoid. But when I glanced down, Michael's name lit up the screen. I answered with a smile I didn't have to force. His voice was warm, that easy calm he carried so naturally. He said he was driving through Columbus later that evening and wondered if I would want to grab dinner somewhere quiet. Somewhere without business chatter or holiday noise. A few months ago, I would have hesitated, thinking about schedules, responsibilities, obligations, waiting at the edges of my life. This time, the answer came easily. I said yes. I would like that very much. He laughed softly and told me he knew a place near the river with good lighting and terrible chairs, but excellent food. Then he said he was glad to hear my voice sounding lighter. When the call ended, I kept holding the phone for a moment, as if the warmth of his voice lingered in the device itself. I set the phone down and noticed the blocked list icon glowing faintly at the corner of the screen. I tapped it out of instinct. The names were still there. Mom. Dad. Sabrina. A row of numbers that once rang so urgently I would drop whatever I was doing to answer. Looking at them now felt like looking at a chapter in a book I had finally shut. Not with anger, not with longing, just with understanding. I thought about unblocking one of them. The idea crossed my mind quickly, the way old habits do. But then I remembered that Christmas morning. I remembered Dad's voice telling me paying the bills didn't buy me a place in the family. I remembered Mom whispering that I needed to stop envying my sister. I remembered the cold air on my face as I walked out the door with my pride held together by threads. And I remembered the moment, barely minutes later, when my hands stopped shaking long enough for me to press block. Back then, it felt like a survival reflex. Now, it felt like a choice. A boundary. A beginning. I put the phone down and walked to the window. Snow was still falling. Thicker now, drifting in slow spirals. The world outside looked soft, untouched, as if someone had laid a blanket over the whole city. I breathed in deeply, letting the quiet settle into me. For the first time in a long time, my life felt like my own. My work. My time. My heart. My future. Not tied to someone else's crisis or disappointment or need. I thought of the years I spent believing that love meant rescuing everyone but myself. I thought of the exhaustion that came from giving without receiving a single ounce of grace in return. And I thought of the moment I finally stepped away from the table where I had spent so long trying to prove I deserved a seat. That was the moment I began choosing myself. I walked back to the dining table, grabbed my coat, and got ready to meet someone who saw me as a person rather than a resource. Someone who asked how I was before asking what I could do. It felt strange but good, like the first warm day after a long winter. Before leaving, I glanced once more at my phone, and the blocked numbers shimmered faintly in the screen's reflection. I smiled. Simple. And certain. I had blocked my parents' numbers on Christmas. And from that day on, I had never looked back. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be liberation. What was your moment of clarity? Or what boundaries have you had to set to reclaim your peace? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more journeys of healing and self-discovery. Like and share if you know someone who might need to hear that sometimes walking away is the strongest form of self-love. Thank you for being part of this healing journey with me. And remember, family is defined by love and respect, not DNA or obligation.